Lord of the Rings Life magazine. So we can see here are the characters. We have Aragorn, Frodo, Sam, Smeagol, Gandalf, and Arwen. And in the background over there we have Mordor. Okay, let's read about the origins, the stories, and the adventure of this Middle Earth, written and created by J.R.R. Tolkien. As you can see, this was made for the 20th anniversary of the film. And here we have Legolas. Very cool first picture. Here we have the contents. It's a scene from Fellowship when they're in the mines of Moria. And they're hearing some goblins and a giant troll come through the door here. Their hands are at the ready for some battle time. This is a very cool battle. This is a beautiful picture. The Reach of the Rings. Classic Hobbit picture. One sprawling tale about humble hobbits doing remarkable deeds captured the imagination of a generation and legitimized an entire genre. Its influence is still felt today. Yes. Fantasy has a history of misfires, filmmaker Peter Jackson told Entertainment Weekly in 2001. Just weeks before the release of his first movie based on The Lord of the Rings, J.R.R. Tolkien's literary landmark for every other genre, westerns, war, you could name truly amazing films. So fantasy is interesting because there aren't really any cliches. It's a chance to give an audience an original experience. Back in 1937, that's precisely what the fledgling novelist and distinguished Oxford professor had done with The Hobbit. His debut set his imagined world of Middle-earth, drew on a long-running fascination with fairy tales and Norse myth, creating a high fantasy world unlike anything ever previously committed to paper. The tale of the resolute homebody, Hobbit Bilbo Baggins, drawn into a quest involving wizards, dwarves, elves, giant spiders, a fire-breathing dragon, a hoard of gold, and a massive conflict among 5 armies, immediately captured the public's imagination and vaulted the novel to bestseller status. Tolkien then spent 17 years crafting the sequel, and it proved worth the wait, spanning more than 1,100 pages over 3 volumes. The Lord of the Rings told a far more complicated story, dense with mythology and invented languages, and made for a dazzling read. Even if perplexed certain critics, it gained an immediate foothold with a generation of readers and forever changed the cultural landscape. His work reflected the potential of fantasy as a genre, and its influence extended beyond fantasy as well, says Tolkien scholar Amy H. Sturgis, an author and professor at Lenoir-Rhyne University in North Carolina. His stories spawned many imitators, but they also continue to inspire creators who seek to tell different tales from other perspectives. Just think of modern mythologies like Star Trek or Star Wars. They used detailed maps and created languages and invented histories for imaginary cultures in order to build immersive worlds and galaxies. They invite audiences to inhabit their functional landscapes and explore the condition through their hopeful morality tales. That's Tolkienian storytelling. The Lord of the Rings novels found an especially receptive audience in the American counterculture, becoming fixers of university bookshelves across the country, which grew their popularity and influence. The Hobbit habit seems to be almost as catching as LSD, proclaimed the Time magazine in 1966. On many U.S. campuses, buttons declaring Frodo lives and Go Gandalf, frequently written in Elvish script, are almost as common as football letters. Among those Me Generation fans was future author Stephen King, who has cited The Lord of the Rings as one of his top 10 favorite novels. Hobbits were big when I was 19, King writes in the introduction to one of the books in his Tolkien-inspired Dark Tower series. There were probably half a dozen Marys and Pippins slogging through the mud at Max Yarker's farm during the Good Woodstock Music Festival, twice as many Frodos, and hippie Gandalfs without number. He continued naming popular characters from the saga. In the decades since, The Lord of the Rings has served as a gateway for readers to discover the joys of adventures set in worlds far beyond. So this is just general, sort of giant interest in the Lord of the Rings film. This here is Priscilla Tolkien. She is J.R.R. Tolkien's daughter. And here is she's unveiling a British stamp featuring her dad's drawing of the hall at Bag End. So you can see here, the top left is Bilbo in his hobbit hole. And here we have what this place described, this awesome conventions and basically people celebrating the ode of the Lord of the Rings. An actual Hobbiton, which you can go to in North New Zealand. It has inspired authors to explore the furthest reaches of their own imaginations and conjure countless stories that are equally beloved. Of all the authors that had an impact on me, Tolkien is right up there at the top, said George R.R. Martin, whose novel spawned the blockbuster TV series Game of Thrones in 2019. I yield to no one in my administration for The Lord of the Rings. I reread it every few years. It's one of the great books of the 20th century. Of Tolkien's many famous fans, however, few may understand and treasure his work more deeply than comedian and late-night talk show host Stephen Colbert, who can even read Tolkien's invented Elvish language. Tolkien's work has been a lifelong haven for me, truly a light in dark places when all the lights went out, Colbert wrote in EU in 2014. An awkward teenager, Middle-earth was what a world I could escape to. Filmmaker Peter Jackson read The Lord of the Rings in his later teen years, not realizing someday he'd return to Tolkien's epic to the forefront of popular culture. Released between 2001 and 2003, Jackson's Cinematic Rings trilogy dominated the worldwide box office, earning billions and racking up countless critical accolades. No longer just the domain of fantasy devotees, the story of heroic Frodo Baggins and his quest to destroy the Ring of Power became inescapable. Though some longtime Tolkien experts were less enamored with the movies than general audiences, ever since the Jackson adaptations were released, there have been fans who confused that Tolkien wrote with what Jackson filmed, wrote Tolkien scholars Wayne Hammond and Christina Skoll in an email to Life. Jackson did well from his films, but they sharply, sometimes angrily divided Tolkien enthusiasts, some of whom praise them highly and accept their many departures from their source, while others, such as ourselves, find them seriously flawed. Subsequent attempts at adaptations that have fared as well as Jackson's Rings juggernaut, theater production Kevin Wallace raised after $25 million to mount a 3.5-hour Lord of the Rings musical on stage in Toronto in 2006. Unfortunately, according to The Guardian, production was an unmitigated disaster. A retooled, trimmed-down version premiered in London's West End in 2007, but unceremoniously closed the following year. If anything, the musical's woes speak to how challenging it could be to get Tolkien right. Jackson struggled with this follow-up adaptation of The Hobbit, which he also made into a trilogy. Although the film once again found commercial success, they didn't catch fire in quite the same way with his Rings trilogy, had by at that point Game of Thrones had become a sensation in its own right, offering fans a more mature take on the fantasy genre. Jackson also stated that behind-the-scenes turmoil on this production left him with less time to prepare than he may have liked. In 2022, Amazon released the first season of a new series, The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, with plans for 5 seasons. Season 2 was released in August 2024. This is set during Middle-earth's Second Age. The show takes place thousands of years prior to the period of Jackson's movies, and there are yet more Tolkien projects ahead. An upcoming anime film, The Lord of the Rings, The War of Rohirrim, is set in 183 years before the events of Jackson's film trilogy, directed by Kenji Kamiyama and starring Brian Cox. The anime tells the backstory of Helm Hammerhand as he defends his kingdom against the Dunlendings. Future adaptations will certainly come and go, but regardless of their success or failure, Tolkien's writings will endure. Even though his stories were conceived long ago and unfold in a landscape different from our own, the crisis the characters face and the work's underlying themes remain eminently relatable and relevant. We live in a complicated world with multiple, simultaneous crises unfolding, says Sturgis. It is easy to feel not only stressed, but also helpless and hopeless. Tolkien reminds us that the smallest and most humble can be heroes. There is a part everyone can play in fighting the darkness and making the world better. Most importantly, Tolkien acknowledges that even in the direst of times, we have reason to hope. Our need for consolation, inspiration, and hope is evergreen. So this is actually a picture shot from the Amazon series, Rings of Power. It's again set in that Second Age when villain Sauron forged all those important rings. And here we go. The magical mind behind Middle-earth. Mild-mannered Oxford professor and World War I veteran J.R.R. Tolkien spun a modest children's book into an epic and especially successful adventure, cementing his legacy as a worldwide fantasy phenomenon. When Christopher Tolkien was asked what his late father, pictured there in 1972, the year before his death, would make of the endearing fame, Christopher replied, "He might have been in turns delighted, charmed, amused, puzzled, disquieted, baffled, indignant, but finally, comprehensively astounded." One afternoon, sometime around 1930, Oxford University professor J.R.R. Tolkien was grading exams when he scribbled a phrase onto a blank page in one of the composition booklets he had been reviewing. It read, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit." The sentence was puzzling to its author, who had not yet dreamed of the noble race of diminutive halflings that feature so prominently in the books he would go on to write. I knew no more about the creatures than that, and it was years before the story grew, Tolkien said in 1963 interviews. I don't know where the world came from. When the story did grow, it grew expansively, and it became the foundation and one of the most influential literary fantasies of all time. Published on September 21, 1937, J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit, subtitled Or There and Back Again, introduced readers to Middle-earth, a magical realm of dizzying complexity where humans live alongside elves, dwarves, orcs, wizards, and of course, hobbits, a peaceful tribe of creatures who dwelled in a verdant land known as the Shire. The novel centered on the incredible story of one specific hobbit, Bilbo Baggins, a homebody who becomes a very reluctant adventurer, journeying across dangerous terrain with a band of 13 dwarves on a quest to reclaim the lonely mountain and its treasures from the fearsome dragon Smaug. Along the way, Bilbo encounters trolls, giant spiders, and a treacherous cave-dwelling creatures named Gollum, from which he proceeds as a mysterious ring with eerie powers. The Hobbit was widely hailed for its originality of vision. So, here we have is the original dust jacket for The Hobbit, published in 1937. The Chronicles of Narnia author and Tolkien contemporary C.S. Lewis called the book a marvelous future classic. It was nominated for the Carnegie Medal, a prestigious British literary honor for children's writing, and the New York Herald Tribune awarded it a prize for Best Juvenile Fiction. Tolkien, however, had never considered the novel one aimed expressively at young readers. When he next visited Middle-earth in print some 17 years later, it was with a much more mature focus. The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, debuted in the UK on January 29, 1954, followed later the same year by the second installment, The Two Towers, and the next year by the third, The Return of the King. Although one referred to as a trilogy, Tolkien had written the saga as one expansive narrative, and that sees Bilbo's cousin Frodo journey into Mordor, the realm of the Dark Lord Sauron, to destroy the Ring of Power the wizard had forged to gain ultimate domination over Middle-earth. Together, those books cemented Tolkien's legacy. Tolkien was a superb storyteller. His skill was prose and poetry ranks among the best in English literature. Tolkien scholars Wayne Hammond and Christina Scull told Life in an email interview. His invented world, peoples, and languages are founded not on superficial ideas, but on some foundations in a mythology decades of the making. He created characters who are relatable and sympathetic. He speaks to what is best in humanity: love, fellowship, sacrifice, loyalty, courage. Of course, there are critics who say that fiction is not as relevant if it does not take place in the real world, the scholars add, but that is a very narrow-minded notion. To millions of readers around the globe, the triumphs of the characters of Middle-earth felt as real and relevant as those they faced in their everyday lives, if vastly more exciting. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien was born January 3, 1892, in Bloemfontein, South Africa, to English parents, banker Arthur and homemaker Mabel. But tragedy marred the future writer's early life. In 1986, while Mabel was visiting family back in England with Ronald, as he was known, and his younger brother Hilary, Arthur's Tolkien's 3-month bout to rheumatic fever culminated in a severe hemorrhage that led to his death. Now widowed, Mabel chose not to return to South Africa and instead made a new home for herself and the boys in the small hamlet of Sarehole on the outskirts of Birmingham. Although Tolkien only lived there from ages 4 to 8, this town in south-central England had a profound impact in his psyche. I was brought up in a considerable poverty, but I was happy running about in the country, he told journalist John Ezzard in 1966. I took the idea of the hobbits from the village, people, and children. They rather despised me because my mother liked me to be so pretty. I went on with long hair and a little Lord Fauntleroy costume. Learning the basics of Latin from Mabel, 8-year-old Ronald was admitted to King Edward's School in 1900. The family then moved around the area until Mabel's death 4 years later from diabetes at the age of 34, after which her 2 boys were sent to live first with an aunt, then in boarding homes with a Catholic priest acting as their guardian. I moved from one orphan's lodging to another in depressing suburbs, Tolkien later told Ezzard. In age 16, he fell in love with a fellow orphan, Edith Bratt. They would go on to marry and have 4 children, John, Michael, Christopher, and Priscilla. Tolkien studied classics and English language and literature at Oxford, graduating with first-class honors in 1915. After enlisting in the British Army and serving in World War I, where he fought in the bloody Battle of the Somme, he returned home, suffering from trench fever. As he recovered, he began his literary sojourn. So these are pictures of his time in World War I. In recalling the heady days of teen courtship with Edith Bratt, Tolkien said her hair was raven, her skin clear, her eyes brighter than you would have seen them, and she could sing and dance. So this is him and his wife. And here you have a second lieutenant in World War I, being Tolkien, fought in France at the Battle of Somme, over here, and contracted trench fever here. After returning home, qualities he felt he lacked in war found their way into his writing. The hobbits are just what I should like to have been, but never was, an entirely unmilitary people who always came up to scratch in a clinch, he said in 1966. So, as he recovered, he began his itinerary sojourn to Middle-earth, setting down the lore of his invented world in writings that would eventually become part of the Silmarillion. Tolkien worked on that epic mythology for most of his life. It would be published in 1977, and it essentially functions as the Bible of Middle-earth. In 1920, Tolkien joined the faculty of the University of Leeds before returning to Oxford as a professor at age 33. There, he was a founding member of the literary discussion groups known as the Inklings, which counted C.S. Lewis as a member, and the pair quickly bonded over their shared love of fantastic tales. The unpayable debt that I owe to Lewis was not to influence, as it is ordinarily understood by sheer encouragement, Tolkien wrote in a letter to Dick Plotz of the Tolkien Society of America in 1965. He was for long my only audience. Only from him did I ever get the idea that my stuff could be more than a private hobby. After writing that first sentence about the hobbit who lived in the hole in the ground, Tolkien spun out the tale of Bilbo Baggins and its exploits with wizards, dwarves, and dragons to entertain his children. The story evolved greatly over time. Early on, the ring was not yet the ring of Sauron, but only a fairy tale device to make one invisible, Hammond and Skull say. As Bilbo's journeys take shape, Tolkien drew inspiration from a variety of sources, including Andrew Lang's colored fairy books, Okay, so here, Tolkien worked in this cozy study at 20 Northmoor Road, one of the several houses he lived in at Oxford. A holiday at Howland House located in the Scottish Isle of Eigg is said to have inspired the author's description of the mountains of Mordor. And I love this room. I absolutely love this room. That's beautiful. Okay, as Bilbo's journey took shape, Tolkien drew inspiration from a variety of sources, including Andrew Lang's Colored Fairy Books, a series of 12 collections of stories for children edited by Scottish poet, novelist, and critic Andrew Lang, as well as E.A. Weichsmith's The Marvelous Land of Snerds, which features a race of people only slightly taller than the average table that dwell in a magical land. George MacDonald's 1872 fantasy novel The Princess and the Goblin and its sequels also were among Tolkien's influences. It's possible to detect or imagine a connection with other works or authors, as critics have done and probably always will do, rightly or wrongly, said Hammond and Skoll. Tolkien had a profound gift for imaginative writing and world building, and was perfectly capable of independent invention. Tolkien completed The Hobbit in 1936 with British publishers George Allen and Unwin, releasing the book the following year. It soon sold out and it went into second printing, prompting the company to ask for a sequel. The follow-up sprawling narrative took far longer to invent, revise, complete than its author had ever imagined. By 1939, he'd completed 16 chapters. I've never quite ceased work on the sequel, Tolkien wrote to publisher Stanley Unwin in December for that year. I fear it's growing too large. I'm not at all sure that it will please quite the same audience, except insofar as they has grown up. Will there be any chance of publication if I can get it done before spring? The spring of 1940 came and went, and for a decade afterward, Tolkien continued to develop the Hobbit sequel, The Silmarillion, before finally presenting both projects to George Allen and Unwin in 1950. When the company backed in publishing them together, the frustrated author shopped both books to other publishers. Finding no takers, he eventually relented and allowed The Lord of the Rings to move forward as a standalone novel. But there were still some hurdles on the way of publication, namely the paper shortages that gripped England after World War II, which limited the number of titles that could be printed annually. George Allen and Unwin opted to break The Lord of the Rings into 3 volumes, with each of those divided into 2 books. The Fellowship of the Ring was published in July of 1954, The Two Towers followed in November of that year, and The Return of the King was released in October 1955. In the first installment, the wizard Gandalf realizes that an aging Bilbo Baggins has the one ring in his possession for some years. With the Dark Lord regaining strength after a defeat of centuries earlier, Gandalf realizes the cursed object must be destroyed. So here, I got distracted by the illustration here. So here we have British illustrator Alan Lee's art featured on the Lord of the Rings series during pre-production. And I guess Peter Jackson hired her as well for their commitment to create the look of Middle-earth for the films. And quote by the illustrator, "I lived in New Zealand while all 3 films were done. I was probably the last member of the crew left there doing the final promotional artwork." However, it can only be unmade in the place where it was forged. With the fires of Sauron's stronghold, Mount Doom, Gandalf recruits Frodo for the first leg of the dangerous mission, but Frodo ultimately volunteers to make the entire journey by himself. When the Two Towers begins, events have centered the fellowship that had been assembled to accompany Frodo on his quest. 3 fellow hobbits, Sam, Merry, and Pippin, 2 men, Aragorn, the brave descendant of kings, and the warrior Boromir, the battle-hardened dwarf Gimli, and elfin prince and accomplished archer Legolas. Frodo and Sam are now journeying to Mordor alone, guided by Gollum. Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas are searching for Merry and Pippin, who have been kidnapped, and Boromir is dead at the hands of the enemy. The middle installment expands the narrative canvas to include enormous tree-like creatures called Ents that stage an attack on Sauron's greatest ally, the wizard Saruman, as well as a deadly spider known as Shelob that paralyzes Frodo with her venom, leaving Sam to temporarily become the bearer of the ring. The adventure culminates the return of the king when Frodo and Sam at last reach the end of their hand-fought journey, only to have Gollum briefly take the ring from the hobbits before tumbling into the fires with his terrible prize. Aragorn reclaims his regal birthright to rule over the reunited kingdom of Gondor and Arnor, and marries his longtime elf love Arwen. Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin return to the Shire to find it decimated by Sauron's forces. Heartbroken, they resolve to return their homeland to its former beauty, but Frodo remains forever changed by his experiences. He's unable to regain the peace and happiness he once felt in the Shire. Sales of the books were strong, but critics were divided. Some, like W.H. Auden, writing in the New York Times Book Review, praised the epic, while others were far less kind. Of the negative critiques, none is more famous than "Ooh, That's Awful Orcs," written by Edmund Wilson and published in the Journal of the Nation in 1956. There is little in the title Lord of the Rings over the head of a 7-year-old child, Wilson wrote. It is essentially a children's book which has somehow got out of hand, an outgrown fairy tale, a philosophical curiosity. Yet by the 1960s, readers, particularly university students, had embraced the Lord of the Rings in a major way. Going to college without Tolkien is like going without sneakers, one mother of freshmen told Time in 1966. So, come back and we will continue reading on the connections between our past writer of the Tolkien world and 25 years ago made with Peter Jackson's interpretation of it, or adaptation, I should say. Thank you guys for reading this comprehensive magazine here as an ode for the Lord of the Rings. Looks like it specializes heavy on the Fellowship. Here we have a quote. Peter Jackson made Tolkien not just mainstream, but intellectually acceptable. And he's Michael Drought, the editor of the Tolkien Studies. This is the architect of Argo. When it came to inventing worlds, Tolkien didn't stop at fanciful lands and wondrous beasts. He also devised entirely new languages. So they are invented languages, but they're completely logical and they're linguistically sound. And said Fred Hoyt, a linguist who taught a class on Tolkien's Elvish in the University of Texas in Austin. Gerald Tolkien is most widely remembered as an author, but he has also accomplished linguist whose love affair with the written and spoken word dated into his teenage years. For Tolkien, Middle-earth simply wouldn't have been a holistic universal experience without its own lexicon, so he invented several, including Sindarin and Quenya for the elves in his novels. What I think is a primary fact about my work that is all in one piece and fundamentally linguistic is an inspiration. The invention of languages is the foundation. The stories were made rather to provide a world for the languages than the reverse. It's absolutely incredible. Well, thank you again for reading. And here are some more pages of this illustration. And there we go. Hope you've enjoyed this chill reading of The Lord of the Rings Life magazine, connecting the genius of J.R.R. Tolkien and its adaptation by Peter Jackson.